1974 was the year Germany, in those days West Germany, won the Football World Cup. The country had another big winner when VW introduced the Golf. One of the few groups with a car component in its name, Bachmann-Turner Overdrive, made it big with "You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet." In the world of Formula 1, there was no champion to be toppled from his pedestal. Jackie Stewart, world champion in 1973, had retired, having won 3 titles and set a new record for Grand Prix wins. The man who should have followed him as the leader of the Tyrrell team, François Sévère, had tragically died practicing for the last Grand Prix of the previous season. For 1974, the loss of these 2 stars resulted in a major shuffle in the ranks of the drivers. A local band plays a bright fanfare to the opening of a new Grand Prix season in Buenos Aires. For the crowd, there's only one driver on the grid, Carlos Reutemann, or Lole as the locals call him. He had stayed with Brabham, the same team as last year, but many drivers had changed allegiance. Colin Chapman was taking a close interest in the McLaren that had tempted Emerson Fittipaldi to leave Lotus. Maybe it had something to do with McLaren's major sponsorship from Marlboro. Mike Halewood was also in a works McLaren, but for commercial reasons, his carried Yardley colours. Ronnie Peterson had stayed faithful to Lotus, or John Player Special as it was officially known, and had been joined by Jackie Ickx. The red helmet of Niki Lauda hadn't changed, but the pipe, designed to provide a fresh air feed in case of fire, was new. So was the car. Niki had gone from BRM to Ferrari. Henri Pescarolo had joined BRM, while another French driver, Jean-Pierre Jarier, was now installed at Shadow. Carlos Reutemann was in his 3rd season at Brabham, but for British driver Richard Robarts, it was his first drive for the team. Clay Regazzoni had, like Lauda, come to Ferrari from BRM. With a new organisation and a more efficient car, hopes at Maranello were high for this year. Jody Scheckter had been impressive in a few outings for McLaren last year, and Ken Tyrrell had persuaded him to lead the new Tyrrell driving team. Emerson Fittipaldi was the youth element in a McLaren team that also had the experience of Denny Hulme. In practice, Lauda had to give best to his new partner. Regazzoni was second to Peterson's Lotus, while Niki was back on the 4th row, alongside Ickx in the other JPS. On the 2nd row, Fittipaldi had an impressive 3rd fastest time ahead of Revson in the Shadow, while Hunt and Reutemann made up row 3. Of the first 8 drivers, only 3 were in the same teams as last year. The grid was crowded, and the marshals called on Fangio, in charge of starting the race, to help shift the crowds. With the grid finally cleared, Fangio calmed the drivers down before unleashing them in their hectic scramble down the short straight and into the first corner. To the delight of the locals, it was Carlos Reutemann that took the lead. The new Brabham BT44, designed by Gordon Murray and taking part in its first race, was obviously highly competitive. With its plain, sponsor-free white finish and unusual angular shape, the car was easy to spot. Not that the Buenos Aires crowd needed any help in picking out their favourite. For the Brabham pit crew and team owner Bernie Eccleston, it looked as though the BT44 was in for a fairy tale first race. Lole was established in the lead, ahead of Hulme and Lauda, front runners after Peterson and Fittipaldi dropped back early in the race. Reutemann looked to have the race in the bag, and then, on the very last lap, the BT44 stuttered and slowed out of fuel. For Argentina and Brabham, it was a disaster. For McLaren and Denny Hulme, it was the gift of a victory. But Denny acknowledged it was a gift and told the crowd how he felt.
I feel very sorry for Carlos. Carlos should have won the race. Gracias!
For Denny Hulme and McLaren, this was a great start to the season. For Ferrari, with Lauda and Regazzoni second and third, it was a great reawakening. The third race of the season, the South African Grand Prix, saw two local brothers in the limelight. Jody Scheckter was the new #1 at Tyrrell, while his brother Ian was driving his first Grand Prix in a locally entered Lotus. This was a one-off drive for Ian, but Jody had the tough task of following in the footsteps of Jackie Stewart. Patrick Depailler, who was also in his first full season of F1, was backing him up. Mike Hailwood had switched from Surtees to McLaren, driving the Yardley-sponsored car, while Arturo Merzario, who'd lost his place at Ferrari to Lauda, was driving an ISO Marlboro Ford for Frank Williams. Jackie Ickx was replacing Emerson Fittipaldi at John Player Special, while Brabham had a new British driver, Richard Robarts. Emerson Fittipaldi was settling in at McLaren, and Francois Migaud was in the French-sponsored BRM team, still running last year's P160E. Graham Hill's Embassy team had switched from shadow cars to Lola. In addition to the regular runners like Tyrrell, the South African race also attracted entries from local teams. Former bike racer Paddy Driver and Ian Scheckter were in Lotuses entered by Gunston, a South African cigarette brand. Clay Regazzoni had stayed with Ferrari, while Denmark's Tom Belso was taking advantage of Frank Williams' advice about his ISO Marlboro. Eddie Kazan, another local driver, had a Tyrrell backed by the South African arm of Graham Hill's sponsor, Embassy. James Hunt's car was new, completely designed and built by the Hesketh team. Niki Lauda, now with Ferrari, probably wasn't too unhappy to have left BRM, although its new car did look elegant. The Austrian set the fastest practice time, ahead of a couple of surprisingly quick qualifiers, Pache in the Surtees and Merzario in the ISO Marlboro. Reutemann, Fittipaldi and Regazzoni were next, ahead of a newcomer, Hans Stuck in the factory march. The start at Kyalami was always spectacular for the cameras, which captured the cars cresting the hump in the main straight and surging down towards the first corner. This time, the battle to be first into Crowthorne was between the two Ferraris and Reutemann's Brabham. The early part of the race saw a continuing battle between the Ferraris and Reutemann, but Lauda and Regazzoni couldn't get ahead of the Brabham. Other top runners dropped out. Both Lotuses were involved in a first-lap accident. Ronnie Peterson was out straight away, and although Jackie Ickx continued, he was using the race as a test session for the new JPS 76, which had replaced the faithful Lotus 72. James Hunt also retired when his new Hesketh broke a universal joint. Then the pace got to the Ferraris. First Regazzoni dropped out, and then, just 4 laps from home, Lauda stopped too, leaving Carlos Reutemann to register his first Grand Prix victory. As Lauda trudged home, the Argentinian came into a storm of applause. Behind him came Jean-Pierre Beltoise in the BRM and Hailwood in his McLaren. There was joy for Carlos Reutemann, but the post-race celebrations were tinged with sadness. Just over a week before the race, Peter Revson had lost his life while testing at the circuit, and the Shadow team had withdrawn from the race as a mark of respect for the talented American. Spain, and the first race in Europe provided ample evidence that the rain in Spain falls mainly on the Jarama circuit. As the drivers lined up for the start in miserable weather, the colourful and voluble clerk of the course, the Count de Villapaderna, was careful to explain his starting procedure to each driver individually.
Then I give the start. But I won't have you waiting nothing, because I know the nerves, and I know that you don't like waiting for the clutch. Be sure. And when they say 30 seconds, I will get up with my flag. I will have always my flag up. And then at 15 seconds, There are my orders, and I give it immediately because I know how nervous you are.
15 seconds.
After 15 seconds.
As usual, the King of Spain was present at the race, and the Count and Jackie Stewart were his guides as he passed through the grid. Then the Count took over the show, unleashing Lauda and Peterson from the front row and 23 other drivers who would have to fight their way through a thick curtain of spray. Peterson led Lauda for the first 20 laps, but then the rain stopped. As the Count explained to a local reporter, this meant that the cars would have to change tyres. Fittipaldi was the first to stop, but soon the entire field was swapping over to slick tyres. This took more than a few seconds, as Lauda's stop in the Ferrari pits shows. Because of the team's experience in sports car racing, Ferrari were better prepared than other teams for wheel changing, but the procedure was still less than perfect. Notice how Ermanno Cuoghi, Lauda's chief mechanic, on the right of the car, has to balance the Ferrari while it's on the jacks. Looking back from the 8-second pit stops of today, the stops of 1974 look disorganised, chaotic even. But this was the way they were. In those days, Grand Prix cars were expected to run for 200 miles on one set of tyres and the fuel they carried to the start of the race. It's a measure of how long the pit stops took that although Lauda's tyre change, notice he took on no extra fuel, lasted around 40 seconds, he maintained the lead. He'd taken it from Peterson just before the round of pit stops began, and he was to hold it for the rest of the race. As the Count signalled 1 lap to go, Lauda was on his way to the first of 25 Grand Prix wins, and his teammate Regazzoni was in second place. As the flag fell, it was a signal for an outburst of joy from Luca di Montezemolo. The 26-year-old lawyer had been managing the team since the beginning of the season, and his influence was being felt. 1973 had been a poor year for Ferrari. 1974 was looking much better. The weather was better for the Belgian Grand Prix at Nivelles, and Ferrari's good form was continuing. Regazzoni was on pole, ahead of Scheckter, and Lauda was third. Emerson Fittipaldi was fourth in the McLaren. No less than 31 cars were on the grid, and they made an impressive sight as they jostled for position. Regazzoni was the early leader, but he was pursued by a quick-starting Fittipaldi with Lauda third. Just before the halfway point, however, the Brazilian and the Austrian both profited by a mistake on the part of Regazzoni. Fittipaldi took the lead with Lauda second. Shadow were back for the second race since the loss of Peter Revson, with Jean-Pierre Jarier and Brian Redman, whose engine, like that of Peterson's Lotus, died a smoky death. Lauda pushed Fittipaldi hard in the latter stages of the race, but could make no impression on the 1972 world champion. Regazzoni had been third, but on the last lap his Ferrari's engine spluttered and Jody Scheckter got past in the Tyrrell. The second win of the season for the Brazilian put him into the lead in the championship, but the competition was close. Lauda and Regazzoni were hard on his heels, 1 and 3 points behind him respectively. You're on a boat in Monaco with David Niven. What else is there to do but gossip?
He's a nice man, I think. Well, he's not a nice man, he's a horrible man, but he's fascinating. I've known her for years. I knew her when she was married to Onassis.
There are certain perks to being a Formula 1 driver, and being the World Championship leader in Monaco opens up even more, as Admiral Emerson Fittipaldi was discovering. But when Sunday comes round, the big boys' toys have to be put away, for there's work to be done. For Emerson, it would be hard work, for he was back on row 7 of the grid. Up at the front, it was all red, with Lauda on pole ahead of Regazzoni. Peterson was third, and Patrick Depailler should have been fourth, but his car sprung a leak on the sighting lap, and he had to start from the back of the grid in his spare car. It's an ill wind that blows nobody any good, however, and the gap ahead of him on the grid gave Jean-Pierre Jarier the chance to make an impression. He took it with both hands, working both his engine and his brakes to the limit in the pursuit of the two Ferraris. The crowd was in for a typical Monaco high-speed procession. Regazzoni, Lauda, Jarier, Peterson, Reutemann, Scheckter, Hunt, Hailwood and Stuck were all keeping close company. But the battle between the two Ferraris and Jarier's shadow was proving to be the highlight of the race. Ronnie Peterson had spun on lap 6, and although he had managed to get going again, he'd lost contact with the leaders. Regazzoni clung on to first place despite the attentions of his teammate, while the sleek black shadow always looked capable of toppling the Maranello cars from the dominant positions. Ickx's engine blew, Hailwood and Schuppen hit the same patch of oil, but the leading trio just kept on going. Stuck hit the barrier after clashing with Hunt. There was no way he was going any further. But as the two Ferraris battled over the lead, things were happening behind them. Ronnie Peterson, who'd been lucky in that he was able to recover from his early spin without damage to the car and without losing too many places, was clawing his way back to challenge the leaders. He had a reputation as something of a wild man behind the wheel, but here, where it mattered most, he was driving smoothly and precisely. First he caught up with Jarier, who was unable to withstand his challenge. Then trouble hit Ferrari. Regazzoni spun and Lauda's ignition failed. Ronnie was in the lead, despite the fact that he was driving last year's car. Lotus had stopped work on the new Type 76, which had not proved successful and which the drivers disliked. As he collected his prize with his wife Barbara, the Swede had reason to be pleased. The next stop was on Peterson's home ground, Anderstorp in Sweden, and the locals were all hoping he could repeat his Monaco success. This was only the second Grand Prix at this track, and it meant that no one had much experience to draw on. At other circuits, the teams and tyre manufacturers could use the knowledge they gained over the years. Here, however, they only had one set of notes to work from. Throughout practice, the pit lane was filled with drivers discussing suspension settings and tyre choices, all trying to get the best out of their equipment.
I think I want to try a softer front roll bar, Emerson. That alteration made an overstand wall. But it felt like it was quick on the straight.
I would like to see when they scare it, but we haven't got it yet.
The fuckers didn't scare it properly, sure. Because this is only we have in Fiorano before you recheck the car on the scale, and it's all right.
Oh, the tyres must be slightly different.
We got the 831. Got the 831s here. Opinions? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what about the gearing? Are they supposed to be the right ones? On the way out, it oversteers nicely, but it's just got too much understeer right. Okay.
Lord Hesketh, the patron of Hesketh Racing, was not a technical man. He left such matters to his designer and his driver, James Hunt, who was perfectly capable of explaining such things.
I've got a lot of grip, but when you turn in and the tyre sort of leans over, then it's a bit understeery because they've got plenty of grip.
The only Grand Prix in the region attracted drivers from all over Scandinavia. Finland's Leo Kinnunen was entered in a Surtees. Kinnunen's drive was a one-off, but Italy's Vittorio Brambilla was now a regular in Formula 1, driving for March. When practice came to an end, it was the Tyrrell team that came out on top, with Depailler taking his first pole position and Scheckter second. Behind them came the two Ferraris, with Lauda ahead, then Peterson and Hunt. As the field got away, it was Scheckter that grabbed the lead as his teammate missed his opportunity. Peterson had made a superb start, and at the end of the first lap, he was behind Scheckter with Depailler third. Then came Lauda, Regazzoni, Reutemann, Hunt, Jarier, Ickx, Fittipaldi and Holm. On lap 6, Halewood's McLaren slowed and stopped. He checked to see what was wrong, but there was nothing he could do to fix it, and he was out of the race. Jean-Pierre Jarier couldn't recapture his Monaco form and had an eventful race. His brakes failed at one point, and later in the race, while he was holding 6th place, his onboard fire extinguisher went off. He still finished 5th. Ronnie Peterson was less fortunate. He had to retire after only 8 laps when a drive shaft failed. The next major retirement was Regazzoni with a broken gearbox, but at the head of the field, as Ronnie walked back to report to Colin Chapman, the Tyrrells reigned supreme. Lauda had been holding a steady 3rd place behind Scheckter and Depailler, but on lap 70, with just 10 to go, he too retired with a broken gearbox. This let James Hunt into 3rd place. Then, with just 2 laps to go, Brambilla, who had made his way up to 5th from 17th on the grid, had his engine go right in front of the pits. As Scheckter and Depailler flashed past to take the flag, the Italian March driver pushed his car across the line to qualify as a finisher. But 10th was poor recompense for the 5th that might have been. For the Tyrrell team, this was an emotional race. It was Schechter's first Grand Prix win and the first Tyrrell 1-2 since the German Grand Prix the previous year with Stewart and Sever. As the crowds rolled in for practice at the Dutch Grand Prix, attention was turning towards the world title fight. Scheckter and Lauda were joint 3rd with 21 points, and Regazzoni was 2nd with 22. The man in the lead, however, with 27, was our driver for this run into the pits, Emerson Fittipaldi. As usual, practice was busy, and the dialogue between Emerson and team manager Teddy Mayer wasn't always smooth.
I'm only dropping the wings on tiny little bit.
No, but I run the car on hard tires for the first time today. On the rear of the
It'll be all right.
In the other Texaco Marlboro McLaren, Denny Holm's conversations with engineer Alistair Caldwell were more taciturn.
almost put it away.
So what worries me is if the car's understeering like mad, we want to know.
James Hunt and designer Harvey Postlethwaite, or Jackie Ickx and Peter War of Lotus, were serious about their in-car discussions. Out of the car at Ferrari, the mood of Regazzoni and Lauda and their team management was lighter. Pescarolo, Migo, Jarier and Beltoise, 4 French musketeers of Formula 1, but only Jarier had a competitive car. The other 3 in BRMs were at the back of the grid. At the front, once again, there were 2 Ferraris with Lauda on pole. Mike Halewood was 4th, a tenth of a second slower than Fittipaldi. Scheckter was 5th and Hunt 6th, ahead of Jarier and Depailler. As the flag dropped, Halewood and Depailler made great starts. On the first lap, they split the 2 red cars. The photographers were running to capture the action, and there was plenty of it. Watch how Regazzoni, having disposed of Jarier and taken 3rd place, goes to pass Halewood. The first attempt was a little risky, but there's no mistake about the second. Ickx wasn't having a good time with Lotus. This smoke screen slowed him but didn't stop him, but a loose wheel nut did. He was 4 laps down at the finish. Ricky von Opel, kicking up the sand in the second works Brabham, hung on to finish 8th. But for Lauda and Regazzoni, everything was going perfectly. Their first and second places were never under threat, and the power advantage of the Ferrari's V12 was clear. Fittipaldi in third was being pressed by Halewood, but the Briton couldn't get close enough to pass. As the Dutch flagman scored a maximum for artistic impression, he signalled the end of a race that showed Ferrari had overcome the problems of the 1973 season. The reorganisation under Luca di Montezemolo was paying dividends. Lauda's win had made the title race much closer, but despite this, it was obvious that there was a friendship and spirit of sportsmanship between the rivals. At the midpoint of the season, Fittipaldi had 31 points, Lauda 30, and Regazzoni 28. McLaren had scored in every race and led the constructors' table with 42 points, 3 ahead of Ferrari. There was a new venue for the 1974 French Grand Prix, the brand new circuit at Dijon-Prenois. By modern standards, the circuit out in the country lacked facilities, but in 1974, this was the state of the art. Practice saw Niki Lauda on pole with Peterson beside him. There was a surprise in third place as young Welsh driver Tom Price, in only his second race for Shadow, out-qualified Regazzoni. Perhaps inexperience was to blame when Price was slow off the mark and was hit by Reutemann. The consternation ahead forced Hunt into a half spin and lucky to be avoided by the rest of the field. Ahead of the midfield mix-up, Lauda took the lead while Price pulled out as a result of the crash. Hunt and Reutemann also had to pull out because of damage to their cars. Lauda led for 16 laps, but then he was passed by Peterson, whose precise progress was being followed on the lap charts of Barbara, his wife, and Colin Chapman, his team boss. The Swede and Lauda were well established at the head of the field, and when Emerson Fittipaldi went out with an oil leak, the Ferrari Drivers' World Championship hopes received a big boost. As the race progressed, Peterson stretched his lead over Lauda, and as the flag fell, Colin Chapman was able to once again throw his hat in the air to celebrate a John Player special victory along with the French crowd. Although he was almost half a minute behind the winner, Clay Regazzoni had held third place throughout the race, so once again both Ferrari drivers were on the podium and adding to their tally of World Championship points. The British Grand Prix was at Brands Hatch, and those who have paid 21st century prices to watch a Grand Prix may want to look away now. With fast cars and beautiful women like Susie Hunt around, it was no surprise that there was a packed house for the race, which started with Lauda and Peterson on the front row. They'd set equal qualifying times, leading Scheckter and Reutemann. But when the flag was dropped, the Swede was caught out. By the time the field dived out of Druids Bend, Ronnie was fourth behind Lauda, Scheckter and Regazzoni. Watching Lauda lead the field along one of Brands Hatch's straights, it's noticeable how many cars took part in Formula 1 races in the 70s. There'd been 35 entries at Brands Hatch, which qualifying cut down to 25 starters. Of these 25, 14 would be classified as finishers. Unluckiest of them was Lauda, who got a puncture with just 5 laps to go, letting Scheckter into the lead. To make things worse for the Austrian, when he pitted to change the tyre on the last lap, he found his exit blocked by people gathering for the finish. By the time he got through, he dropped from 5th place to 9th. It took until the autumn for his protest to be accepted and his 2 points awarded. For now, however, Fittipaldi was clawing back championship points. Back in the shadow of the famous castle, the German Grand Prix was at the Nürburgring. The McLaren team was keen to maintain Fittipaldi's challenge for the championship. The mechanics were working hard, doing the 1,001 tasks required during a Grand Prix weekend, including changing engines. In the pit lane, James Hunt needed help from his mechanics. But Guy Edwards, who failed to qualify in Graham Hill's second Lola, at least had the pushing problem sorted. At Ferrari, chief engineer Mauro Forghieri, the man whose redesign had made the 312B3 competitive, was looking after Regazzoni and Lauda. They had reason to be thankful to him, for they were first and second on the grid. At McLaren, however, there were technical problems to be sorted out.
Could be something to do with the dump section. Something that gets wet and out.
Have a look inside the distributor's net. Have a look inside the distributor's net.
Jackie Stewart had reason to smile. Jody Scheckter was 4th on the grid. The safety campaign Jackie had led was bringing results, as the drivers were briefed on emergency procedures.
There's no hurry, no hurry.
Okay, what kind of flag?
A yellow flag above his head, right up in the sky, like this. Wildly, waving very hard.
All the marshals posters just
All the Linger cars.
Linger cars.
Jody Scheckter got his briefing from clerk of the course Prince Metternich, under the scrutiny of Brabham team owner Bernie Eccleston. At over 14 miles in length, the Nürburgring was a special case in terms of track safety, and despite the expenditure of millions on upgrading it, it was still dangerous. Safety precautions were paramount. Emerson Fittipaldi knew something was wrong with his car as he took his place on the grid. He couldn't select first gear. He raised his hand, but was hit by teammate Denny Hulme. Denny pulled in immediately, but although Emerson got going, his car was damaged and he retired on lap 2. McLaren wasn't the only team in trouble. Within moments of the start, Lauda had spun into retirement, leaving Regazzoni to carry the Ferrari banner on his own. The Swiss did a good job, keeping ahead of Scheckter, Reutemann and Jochen Mass in the Surtees. Scheckter held on to a distant second place, finishing over 50 seconds behind Regazzoni. He had a lonely race, for Reutemann in 3rd was half a minute behind him when the flag came down. For Regazzoni, it was a great day. It was his 2nd Grand Prix victory, coming almost 4 years since his first in Italy in 1970. But it wasn't just a win. It was a win that, thanks to the fact that neither Lauda nor Fittipaldi had finished, put him at the head of the championship table. Most unfortunate team of the day was McLaren. It lost 2 cars at the start, and then, later on, Mike Halewood was involved in a serious accident that ended his racing career. Emerson Fittipaldi arrives in style for the Austrian Grand Prix at the Österreich-Ring. But he soon put on his business suit and is ready for work.
Good morning.
With 2 drivers in the top 4 of the championship and just 1 point behind in the Constructors' Championship, the pressure is on at Ferrari. But with the eyes of Italy upon it, the pressure is always on at Ferrari, and the team carries on as usual. It's business as usual at Tyrrell too. Calmly, Ken Tyrrell discusses qualifying tactics with Jody Scheckter.
Let's put the maximum front wing on, then we can finish with the front, can't we?
Yeah, and then we can start knocking
Progressively off the back, yeah.
David Hobbs was the new driver of the Yardley McLaren. His qualifying time was nothing to brag about, but when Fittipaldi, Pace and Lauda discussed their times, it seemed they might be guilty of exaggeration.
I made you talk. Yeah. No? Agora, se fez? No. Sendo cheio.
For the first time since Brazil, Reutemann was on the front row of the grid alongside poleman Lauda. The Brabham BT44 had steadily improved during the year, and the Argentinian shot into the lead. Underlining the BT44's performance, at the end of the first lap, Pace, who had left Surtees and joined Brabham, was third, behind Lauda and ahead of Regazzoni, Hunt, Scheckter, Fittipaldi and a howling pack of pursuers. Regazzoni, pushing hard, soon got past the Brabham number 2. Now it was Ferrari second and third, Brabham first and fourth. Fittipaldi moved up to fifth after Jody Scheckter retired on lap 9 with engine trouble in the Tyrrell. Regazzoni's position in the World Championship meant that the McLaren crew was keeping a keen eye on Fittipaldi's strongest challenger. Tyler Alexander, who'd been with the team since it was formed, was checking times in the pits when Lauda's car came in to retire. But Regazzoni was still out there. Lauda's retirement was good news, but it was cancelled out when Emerson stopped out on the circuit. With Lauda and Scheckter now among the pit spectators, Alexander's keen ears detected a problem.
Ferrari's definitely ill.
It was a puncture, and it cost Regazzoni 5 places.
Here comes Emerson now. Regazzoni's going to drop out. Regazzoni can't get any points, and then it's the same as before the race?
I think, no, the crankshaft broke. The flywheels disconnect from the engine. I think the engine's still turning.
So relief for McLaren and jubilation for Carlos Reutemann with his second win of the year. The Brabham team was happy because Carlos Pace had climbed back to second before retiring with fuel feed problems, and John Watson had finished fourth in a privately entered BT44. McLaren had a podium place with Denny Hulme in second, and James Hunt took third for Hesketh. Fittipaldi and Lauda hadn't finished, but Regazzoni had only added 2 points to his title score. Things were still close at the top of the table. The unique atmosphere of Monza welcomed the competitors for the Italian Grand Prix. The Italian crowd was eternally enthusiastic, despite the fact that the world's economy was in a bad way. An oil crisis was threatening the automobile industry that provided so much support for racing. Car sales were down by around 25% across the world, and things looked grim. But Formula 1 continued, and the drivers walked to their cars, supported by the cheers of thousands of fans. Practice was the usual business of adapting to the circuit. Emerson Fittipaldi was a model of calmness, but Niki Lauda was complaining about other drivers. Carlos Pace was analysing his Brabham's behaviour.
Steering the other side all the time.
Betty Hill was just watching, and a relaxed Reutemann was checking his times. Rolf Stommelen had joined the Embassy Hill team in Austria, while Regazzoni and the Ferrari engineers were feeling the unique pressure of their home Grand Prix. Their efforts paid off, for Lauda took pole position. Fittipaldi qualified 5th behind Lauda and 3 Brabham BT44s, emphasising the efficiency of Gordon Murray's design. Reutemann was on the front row, while the second row was made up of Pace and John Watson. As the crowd settled down in the afternoon heat, they could anticipate a good race. As the field dashed off towards the first of Monza's chicanes, one of the BRMs was left in their dust. All three cars would be out before the third lap, a sad result for a proud team. Ferrari pride was high, however, as Lauda led the field and Regazzoni started to attack the Brabhams. After 30 laps, the Ferraris were first and second, but Regazzoni was ahead and Lauda's car was leaving an ominous smoke trail. 2 laps later, he was in the pits and the marshals were clearing the trail of oil he had left. Regazzoni held the lead for another 10 laps, but then his engine also failed, leaving Ronnie Peterson in the lead ahead of Fittipaldi. Emerson's wife was sufficiently optimistic to play up to the camera. Peterson was having to fight to hold off Fittipaldi. His wife Barbara and Colin Chapman had no time for smiles. For the last 10 laps of the race, Peterson and Fittipaldi circulated in close company, while Scheckter followed about half a minute behind. With Regazzoni, his major championship rival, out, Fittipaldi could be content to stay behind the Swede, who was in no mood to be passed. When the flag dropped, Fittipaldi was just 0.8 of a second behind the Lotus. As the crowd stampeded across the track for the podium ceremony, the Brazilian knew that 6 points against no scores for the 2 Ferrari drivers had helped his title hopes. But Scheckter's third place had put a new challenger into the running. With 2 races to go, Regazzoni had 46 points, Scheckter 45, and Fittipaldi 43. As the fans made their way to Mosport Park, there were new drivers and new cars in the lineup for the Canadian Grand Prix. Jarier and Fittipaldi were regulars. The car 66 was a new Penske driven by Mark Donoghue. Jacques Lafitte was almost new. This was only his second Grand Prix. Jochen Mass was new at Yardley McLaren, while BRM were hoping to improve the team's lackluster performance by entering Chris Amon in the number 15 car. Among the regular competitors were Rolf Stommelen in the Embassy Lola, Jody Scheckter, Carlos Reutemann, Carlos Pache, James Hunt, Graham Hill, Clay Regazzoni, John Watson in the Hexagon Brabham, Denny Hulme, and Jean-Pierre Beltoise. Canadian driver Epi Weitzer brought up the rear in one of last year's Brabhams. After practice, the talk at McLaren and Penske was of tyres.
Well, for me it is, yes. Because it doesn't wobble in the rims.
Flat spotted. You got another one you can put on?
Yeah.
The Grand Prix regulars had to take Penske seriously. It was a very professional team with plenty of experience in top-class racing in America. Dan Gurney, the first American to build his own Formula 1 car, was an interested spectator at its first outing. As the McLaren mechanics wheeled their cars out to the grid, they were heading for widely separated positions. Fittipaldi was on pole, but Hulme was back on the 7th row. Next to Fittipaldi was Lauda, and on the 2nd row were Scheckter and Reutemann ahead of Regazzoni and Jarier. At the start, it was Lauda who took the lead, ahead of the other 3 championship contenders, Fittipaldi, Regazzoni and Scheckter. If it stayed like this, the title race was going to be very close. Goodyear and Firestone were still the only companies producing tyres for Formula 1, and Goodyear had built up an advantage over their competitor, with most of the top teams using their products. Compared with the tyres of 30 years later, whose sizes and patterns are set by the regulations, those of 1974 were much bigger and wider at the back and of much smaller diameter at the front. And of course, for maximum grip, they were completely smooth. As Roger Penske signalled to his driver, he could be satisfied with Donohue's progress. 24th on the grid, he finished 12th, an honourable first appearance. McLaren had more reason for satisfaction. Fittipaldi had harried Lauda throughout the race, and on lap 67 of the 80, the Austrian had made a mistake and gone off the track. But Regazzoni had finished second. That meant that with one race to go, the Brazilian and the Swiss were equal on points. Whoever finished ahead in the US Grand Prix would win the championship. Unless, that is, Scheckter won at Watkins Glen. He had retired from this race after brake problems, but if Fittipaldi finished 5th or lower in the US, the South African would be the champion. The title race was moving towards an exciting conclusion. Once again, the fall colours of upstate New York provided the backdrop for the final Grand Prix of the season. This time, however, this wasn't just the last race. It was the title decider, and everything depended on the result, so the tension was high as the show got underway. Mark Donohue and the Penske team were so new to Formula 1 that they made James Hunt and Hesketh look like veterans. But they weren't the only new boys. Mario Andretti and the new Parnelli team had also made their debut in Canada, finishing ahead of Donohue. Both American newcomers were showing great professionalism. Professionalism wasn't a word that would have been applied to Ferrari in 1973, but this year there was a new dynamism in the team, and the cars and drivers had gone from also-rans to title contenders.
In unofficial testing.
Learning all the time, Penske's team qualified Donohue halfway down the grid. Andretti and the Parnelli, however, really shone. Mario finished 3rd on the grid, but McLaren were finding it difficult to set up their car.
The wide on the soft.
Wide.
You'll see many fine automobiles from yesteryear.
Wide. The one you tried.
We've had dozens of entrants.
But they rolled.
We know you enjoy looking at these cars.
Fittipaldi qualified 8 places behind poleman Reutemann, who finished up lapping in less than 1 minute 39 seconds.
Official. 39.
Another quarter of an hour. We can put on another one here.
Ingegnere Forghieri of Ferrari took a personal interest in setting up his cars, but 5th and 9th on the grid for Lauda and Regazzoni was disappointing. Fittipaldi was disappointed too.
We're going about half the quick guys were going about 3 or 4 tenths quicker than you.
Only?
At that time, only, yeah. Now, Lauda's Rega has not gone as quick as you today. And
For the
Reutemann has gone the quickest today, but not now, earlier.
Very early on.
Away from the pits, starter Tex Hopkins was discussing the technicalities of his job with Sterling Moss.
Got a 50-gallon oil drum over there to stand on.
Really? We want to be bloody careful then.
Yeah. I might break my neck.
I wasn't worried about your neck. There's a few other things you could write.
Oh, thank you. You're looking good. You really are. Very good.
As the McLaren crew wheeled Emerson to the start, he was encouraged to see that he had supporters from Brazil to cheer him on. But at a race held so close to New York, you could be sure that there would be no lack of Italians yelling for Ferrari. Only South African Jody Scheckter, starting in 6th place, will be lacking in support from home. As Tex Hopkins dropped the flag, it was Reutemann that made the best start, with Hunt alongside him on the grid challenging him closely. The two would race like this for 54 of the 59 laps. The British driver battled brake problems early in the race, but it was a fault in the fuel feed system that was to rob him of 2nd place. Behind the leading pair, Pace, Lauda, Scheckter and Fittipaldi were keeping close company, with Regazzoni ahead of the rest of the pack. As the race progressed, it became clear that both Ferraris had handling problems. Regazzoni stopped to try to remedy matters, as did Lauda. Nothing could be done, however, and though Regazzoni continued well down the field, Lauda retired after 39 laps. Reutemann was justly elated with his win, but the big prize was Fittipaldi's. Scheckter had pulled out on lap 45 with fuel feed problems, and Regazzoni was well out of the points, so the Brazilian's fourth place earned him his second world title. The McLaren crew were jubilant. It was their first Drivers' Championship, and they'd also won the Constructors' Championship. Bruce McLaren would have been proud. It was fitting that after a superb championship win, Emerson Fittipaldi should be congratulated on the podium by last year's champion Jackie Stewart, present at the race as a TV commentator. Carlos Pace and James Hunt, second and third behind Reutemann, were representatives of the new generation of drivers that will go on to challenge the established stars. And as the 1974 season ended, there were signs that there will be more good racing in 1975. Ferrari had recovered from its bad patch, and Regazzoni had finished only 3 points behind Fittipaldi. Tyrrell had overcome the difficulties of starting the season with 2 new drivers, and Brabham had shown that the BT44 was a car able to match and beat the best of the rest.